podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, one of the world's leading international professional bodies which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. I'm your host, Rob Lawrence, and in this new series, I'm delighted to introduce you to a small number of coaches who specifically focus on coaching men. We are aware that many men are struggling with their lives, their sense of meaning and purpose, their relationships, finances, physical and mental health and well-being. You'll hear from some of those who share their own life-changing stories, why coaching men matters, the various approaches they use, and the impact they are having. My guest today is somebody who coaches men at midlife. He is somebody who is curious about exploring the intersection between art, nature, identity and leadership, and sitting without the answers. With an MBA from the innovative One Planet Exeter Business School and a background in design, which brings up some surprising and insightful considerations for coaching, I'm pleased to invite onto this final episode of this Coaching Men series, Al Kennedy. So, Al, a very warm welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Rob. Nice to be here. Look forward to it.
Yeah, it's great to have you on the show today. Perhaps for the benefit of our listener, we can begin here. The series is about coaching men, and I know that's something that is a speciality of yours, but I'm keen to get a sense of how you show up in the world today and perhaps how you've arrived at what it is that you do today, Al.
Thanks, Rob. What comes to mind straight away is maybe 58 years of practice, I guess. I'm at a certain time of life, and I guess that's really where my focus is now as a coach. I trained as a designer and went to college in Liverpool and London and did my training as a graphic designer and spent most of my career building that side of my professional work in London. That's always provided me with a kind of curious mind, always being comfortable asking questions. That's the kind of running joke with the designers. They'll always redesign the brief, no matter how tight it is. Whatever's given to you, a designer will always kind of try and rewrite it. So I've been comfortable asking questions. Professionally, that was the beginning of my career, and that took me up to my mid-30s. I had a successful design practice in London. We were working with a lot of corporate clients, and then you moved out of town, you moved out west. With my family, I was raising a family at the time. And at that critical inflection point, there was 2008, there was financial crisis, there was lots of conversations around sustainability, and I was trying to move my design business towards working with much more socially focused clients. So as a designer, I was getting into interesting conversations about strategy and purpose and mission and values. And I think that's what really opened up my curiosity about how are we really going to make change in the world. And to cut a very long story short, I've moved direction slightly because I was very curious about what sustainability really meant in those days. And in those days, it was very much established in the marketing department. It's very much a PR project. But I was having conversations with business leaders and business owners who were starting social businesses and charities and social enterprises. And that connection between the individual and business became a really interesting crossover for me. So I ended up closing down my design business and taking the One Planet MBA down in the University of Exeter Business School because I wanted to understand the business case of sustainability. I was really curious about how we could use business as a force for good. So my emphasis moved from the kind of visual and creation of marketing communications and digital tools and platforms much more towards mission, values, purpose, and those types of stories in the world. So that led me to complete my MBA program. When I tell my origin story, I guess I kind of always fall between a creative path and a business path, slightly outside both, is where I kind of like to walk. It's what might be described as an edge walker.
Yeah.
Not necessarily out of choice, maybe, but I find some of the most interesting things happen on the edges. I can speak to that maybe later on, but that's definitely true in nature, as well as any kind of systems change. I think the edge is where some of the most exciting stuff happens. So I feel comfortable there, and I feel comfortable there asking questions. And as I've got older, I'm now 58, those questions have changed somewhat, and they're starting to become a lot deeper. A little bit of a straight line to start with, building a career and a family, and I'm very privileged to be able to do that. But now kind of in the second half of life, and I'm sure we'll touch on this a little bit later, this is where I'm really interested. There's another threshold that's presenting itself to me and potentially to other men as well.
Yeah, that threshold I'd love to ask you about, but maybe we can frame the conversation with perhaps quite a bold question really, but why coaching men?
I haven't always coached men specifically. I kind of always align my practice with where I've been at in my journey. as you probably picked up and understand, that I've always coached alongside my business interests as well. So I've always founded my own companies, had a training business as well as a design company. But I've always coached alongside that. And part of my work was really helping leaders and founders and social entrepreneurs and coaching them originally. That was the beginning of my practice. But more recently, I guess the link between what's happening in the wider world and where I think I could have most impact is with men. My journey, my realization around some of the things that need to change in the world, and maybe some of our mindsets and some of the ways that we've been shaped by a particular system, is something that I think we need to pay attention to. So it just happens that the way I like to design my practice has really focused on what I think I can really relate to as a man. And especially, as I said before, a man that's now approaching 60 years old and has some sort of history behind them. I've kind of walked a few paths. I have some experience in the world, both from a business point of view and a personal point of view. And I think that's something that I can hold with integrity. I'm a big man as well. I'm 6'5". I'm a big guy. And sometimes, actually a lot of the time, I've never needed to have to talk up too loudly in a room or in situations. I am noticeable, sometimes not for the right reasons, but I'm noticeable. And actually, there's a way of being with that type of body that I inhabit that I don't need to talk too much. So I'm comfortable holding space and holding others questions, both physically, I guess, in some senses, but also emotionally, because I have traveled through some of my own stories and issues as well. So I guess I come with some credibility and some capacity, both physically and intellectually, to hold some of the questions that I know modern men are really wanting to explore and maybe don't have the opportunity to do that. That's kind of where I'm at the moment. As you know, and we all know, the subject of masculinity or masculinities and men in the world is being discussed quite widely. I'm here to celebrate men as much as possible, but also create new conditions for different types of conversation. And I think coaching, for me, really provides that. And there's different flavors to what coaching can be in the world, definitely. So my flavor is just one of those.
You mentioned there having capacity, and you've mentioned questions a couple of times, and I'd love to invite you to share some of the questions that you think are important and worth sharing, not necessarily for us to look for an answer by any stretch on the podcast today, but for our listener to hold. You were saying there about holding capacity. And I'm curious in what way you work with men in order to allow them to begin to either express themselves or at least move forward from the place that they arrive at when they meet you.
I think you said the word allow, which I think really is fundamental to the way I might, again, design these containers, as I might call them, and coaches will understand the well-used phrase of a container. I think my design approach is very much in creating very tight, rigorous containers to hold whatever needs to be held. My job actually is to allow, as you said, permission to step into those places, whether they be walks or pilgrimages or journeys or circles or even writing poetry, whatever it may be. Creative practice and creative spaces that I think I'm really bringing to coaching, which is quite maybe counter to some of the current methodologies or logic that we see in coaching that's been inherited. And I think the context that we now inhabit in the wider world, everything is up for redesign. That permission or that allowance, as you talked about, is really the work I do. Once that's done, and I do it with absolute rigor and depth, I really do, I step out of the way then, really. And my job is kind of done. All I'm doing is facilitating that space and making sure that whatever comes up is held with responsibility and care and sensitivity, and not from a solution or a fixed kind of mindset, but it's spacious enough. Because you scratch just below the surface and it's all there, especially with men. But that armor that we all carry and wear presents first. And once you get beyond that, which is only really a couple of millimeters deep, it's all there. And I think it's just allowance and permission. And actually, I don't have to do very much. We can talk about what the environment or what landscape or what nature brings to that, because that mirror and that connection to those type of spaces does all the work for me. I don't really need to do very much, to be honest.
When I was researching a little bit about your background ahead of our conversation today, one of the quotes that stood out for me was that nature has the answer. I really liked that. And I was wondering if you could perhaps tell us a little bit more about that in the context of what you've just kindly shared with us there.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. It's nice to hear that back. I think how I respond immediately is an answer. It's not the answer. There are many answers to many questions, but I think, maybe I'd rewrite that as an answer. Because I do think quite widely about the context that I'm coaching within. And I think there's lots of debate in coaching communities about how much a coach brings to the relationship, how much a coach brings to the dynamic. I think we're all discussing different shifts and different emphasis around that partnership or that coaching dynamic in any coaching program or process. I think I've firmly landed in a place where I can only really bring myself and all of myself. And I encourage that with my coachees as well. Everything is welcome. Again, I hold that with care and ethics as a primary concern. What I mean by that is that everything is relational and contextual. So coaching outside or coaching with an earth-centered kind of mindset or process is really about inviting all of that into the conversation and the dynamic. And I'm not talking about just taking coaching outside and using nature as a backdrop. That's fundamentally important. The training I received from Earth Self, which I took in 2019, and going back to my story about what I was specifically looking for in coaching training, was about a process and a methodology that really centered the earth and the environment as part of the process and not a kind of nice to have or an add-on or a backdrop. I think we're seeing much more of that in coaching process and practice these days. So bringing that into the conversation and bringing a much more relational and embodied way of having a coaching conversation is really fundamental, because I think especially for men, that ecological self has been severed, and that instincts that we all have deep down, whether it's to light a fire, to be outside, to feel free, to have all we possess on our back and just walk through the woods or climb a mountain or, whatever it may be, on the outside might seem inherently masculine or direct or of a particular type of character. But I think actually there's much more nuance to it. There's much more deep, rhythmic, seasonal, and just a reset of your system. Your internal systems reset and recalibrate when you spend time out in nature. And I think when we talk about maybe the pilgrimage or some of the coaching offers that I'm offering into the world, that 3-day process is fundamental to that. It's about being out in a place where you can actually start to physiologically slow down and reset and recalibrate and ground yourself in a place where different things start to happen, different messages appear, different thoughts happen, you think differently. This is all scientifically proven around, especially for creatives, how you think outside. And I've done lots of work and walking projects and practices with people outside around creativity. And I think, we know the evidence is all there, and we see a huge resurgence of people understanding that this makes them feel good. Just being outside is a wonderful, simple thing. So humans are really desperate to feel that reconnection. So in a coaching context, I think working with that is the only way I would do it these days, really. Although I appreciate that there's a privilege to it. Not everyone is able to get outside. Sometimes it's not safe to go outside. There are contexts and conditions where that's just not possible. Through disability or any ways you show up in the world, sometimes that's a challenge. So we've got to be very mindful of how these coaching process or practices are offered. And I think my training was very much about still being able to bring some of that even through a Zoom call. So that reconnection piece and that ability to work in the environment is absolutely fundamental to the work. Ultimately, that's the big question. I don't really like to frame it as reconnect, but how do we rediscover our natural self? Because the modern system, which puts men in a particular dynamic and both harms men and women, this modern world that we live in, is going in the completely opposite direction. So how do we really slow down, pay attention, get back into our bodies and be part of that wider system? And I think that's really where my practice kind of lives, a slowness, a deepness, and out in the world.
That's fascinating. It's a fascinating perspective, and I'm really grateful that you've shared that. I'm curious with those that you are able to work with outside, and I'm also curious as to how it works over Zoom, so we'll perhaps come back to that. But for those that you work with outside, I imagine, I'm making an assumption here, you have various opportunities in varying lengths of duration with which to work with people outside. And I can imagine with the 3-day opportunities that you've hinted at there being a process of getting into it. With those and also the shorter duration opportunities, are there any barriers or do you find there's resistance? What's the trajectory look like for somebody trying to access what you're talking about there and what tends to come up with those that you work with, crossing that horizon, as I say it?
That's a good question, Rob. It's been a real challenge, I've got to be honest. Men are difficult to get out into these types of conversations and dynamics. And I include myself in all of this. And I think, one thing I really want to get across is my practice is really a reflection of kind of where I'm at in my journey too. I'm really walking alongside my clients. And I don't mean that in a kind of client way. I have the expertise and they're paying for a particular service. I'm really exploring this in the moment, pretty much live, I guess. All I can really do, as I said before, is create the container. If I talk to my potential clients about coaching, it comes with a load of preconceived ideas. Normally in these types of relationships, especially if you're talking with leaders or CEOs, there might be a sponsor. The company might be having a particular agenda around what needs to happen for this particular leader or this CEO, and that complicates things. Or even if you use the word therapeutic approach, that tends to scare men off a little bit as well, because that comes loaded with a particular type of dynamic. A lot of people working in men's work is wrestling with this idea of how do we not make men feel like they're not showing up in the right way. But I think my view is we have to provide different types of spaces for men to be able to do. And as I said before, surface the things that they're really holding down all the time anyway. So I think it's a matter of how do we design better spaces for men to open up, because I know that they are beautiful, vulnerable, emotional beings. I know that we all are, but I think it's too easy just to say that men aren't showing up in the right way. So to kind of answer your question, my coaching practice isn't probably easy to describe. Hopefully I'm doing a good job of it. Sometimes it's men's circles over a seasonal period in a particular piece of land with a particular community. Sometimes, as we touched on before, it might be a book about poetry, asking them to write about their fathers or their experience of fatherhood, or creative processes that might be, again, coaching type environments, or it might be related to some of the business work I do, some of the consultancy work I do with social enterprises or charities. It's much more about how does coaching fit into the context that I'm working in, rather than trying to bring men into my coaching space. This pilgrimage offering, which is called The Long Walk, is really about prototyping, again, as a designer. Is this a kind of a space that might be attractive to men, rather than trying to fit men into my practice? Does that make sense? I know from my experience, because I spent the last 2 years really relishing that space to think and process some of my thoughts as I go through a midlife transition. I've used pilgrimage, I've used solo walking practices and processes to really take a question out into the world and see what the environment offers me back without looking for a particular quick fix. And I think that extended type of practice is something, as I said, I've practiced, but I'm now bringing to the world to see whether other men would be interested in being invited into that. Now, I'm not looking to scale this. I'm not looking to sell it to everybody. I'm very happy working deeply and slowly with the men who really want to kind of ask much more deeper questions. The two ultimate questions: who am I and what the hell's going on? That's pretty much it. And I think men don't really have those types of spaces to be able to do that necessarily without some preconceived idea as to where they want to get to or what happens next. And I think that is a reflection of the system that they're in or we're in. How do I bring different types of spaces that are intentionally designed with rigor and care, but maybe fall between wild camping, adventure, therapy, coaching, mentoring? And where I've got to is my focus on midlife is this is a second threshold. I mean, this is well documented. Kind of lead into this idea that what we see in the world outside our window and on our news feeds is a mirror to what's happening with men internally. So I think going back to why I work with men is because that's where I think the most impact can be had. We see it play out in the world, and I'm not going to name various people that we can see playing out in the world, but that's because I believe we have no midlife threshold to really guide people towards the second half of life and deconstruct an egocentric persona that you built up in the first 20 years of your life. That needs to be broken down for something new and much more regenerative and creative and caring to come forth. This is Jungian theory and approach. It's called individuation, but it's a process that I'm really curious about. And I don't see any pathways or rites of passage out in the world that speak to modern contemporary men that allow them to go through this practice. And that's really what I'm pushing at.
Yeah, without a very detailed worldview, I would tend to agree with you there that there's not really anything freely or widely available for men at this midlife threshold that you're referring to there, Al, as I see it. Equally, I see having two young boys, there's not much out there for young men either entering adulthood and what it means to be a man and providing opportunities for them to feel that transition and to embrace that transition, or even to acknowledge that transition that they're going through even at that age. And I think it's a similar but different thing that you're referring to there, which is really insightful and honest. I particularly enjoyed what you offered in your response there to my previous question. There was so much in there, Al, I'd love to talk to you about. Unfortunately, I'm sure we're not going to have enough time to get into it all, but the key themes that were poking out at me there, which I thought all of which were quite insightful, is one, how the coaching work that you do reflects where you're at in your own journey now. And I think that's interesting. I remember a business mentor of mine, Charlie Gilkey, who we've had on the podcast and under a completely different, almost a marketing business type conversation. I remember hearing from him once that often our businesses or the problems we're trying to solve in life, i.e. the business we create, is because we personally are trying to solve that problem. And then we're doing it for others, but that's because we're trying to figure it out ourselves. And then there's this sort of collaboration. So it really reflects that back for me, which crosses time and space. A couple of other thoughts there, very intriguing, you coming from a design background. And what I was hearing is almost this symbiotic nature of actually we need to create the environment. As we well know, there's lots of research to show that the key fundamental that affects somebody's behavior is the environment that they're in. So put somebody in a different environment, and we haven't got into creativity yet, but this idea sort of comes to mind of experimentation and creativity of, well, what if? It's that question of what if? Perhaps we'll try this approach, or we could try this, as you're figuring it out for yourself and with others, and that sense of collaboration there.
Yeah.
But I think what was particularly revealing for me is that one of the things that I love about coaching is it doesn't have the answers.
Yeah.
It's almost, we're going to go out there, we're going to do this work, but we'll just see where it goes. We'll see where that takes us. And I think there's something quite special about that I picked up on there.
Yeah, thanks, Rob, for that reflection. It's really interesting. It brought me back to a real revelation when I was doing my MBA program in Exeter. I was introduced to this idea of biomimicry, which is basically nature's principles. And in this context, it was trying to be applied to business situations. And I think we're still trying to do that. I'm not sure it's working, but just called a different name every time I look. But it really had a massive impact on me because as a designer, no one had ever told me this before. And I was like, well, this makes complete sense. Using all the 3.8 billion years of nature's innovation, R&D, to apply to human problems or human context makes sense. And there's many examples of it, which I won't go into now, but I think you're right. I think as a designer, all we can do, one of nature's principles, is really just create the conditions. And I think coaching can sometimes maybe be accused of trying to provide answers, or maybe that's what clients come to coaching for answers. And coaches inevitably might react and say, well, I need to be an expert. I need to have an answer. I need to have a model. I need to have some sense of solution or transformation, or frankly, almost impossible request in many situations, because we can't have all the answers, and nor should we. What I've learned through my original coaching training, my ILM7 coaching training, my climate change coaching training, all the other practices and processes I've learned along the way, the more I can let go and the more I can get out of the way, but from a place of rigor and intention and deliberateness, I guess, if that's a word, the more effective that space becomes, because my clients and other people's clients have the answers in them themselves. They always carry it with them. It's just permission and creating the right conditions for them to see that and for someone to reflect it back. And in my case, the environment or a journey or a process that brings especially men out of their heads and back into their bodies provides those pathways and gives my clients the answers they're looking for, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
My job, as you said quite rightly, as the designer, is almost just to pay attention to the container and the context, to make sure that the journey is planned, everything's looked after. If anything comes up, I have backup and support. I'm supervised. All the practical stuff as well, health and safety, ethics, communication, travel plans, food, comfort, all of those things are designed, and I go into extreme detail to make sure that that is almost invisible, to allow whatever needs to come, and no one has to think about it. It's all been taken care of. I mean, that's like anything, isn't it? When you don't notice it, let's say even in technology or restaurant service or whatever it may be, when you don't notice it, it's normally because it's very, very good. But when it gets in the way and it's a problem or it's jarring, it becomes an issue. So I think part of the coaching work I do is to really pay attention to the space and facilitate that well with obviously nature as my co-coach, but beyond that as well, not trying to use nature as a resource or a kind of a clumsy metaphor or a tool, but to really have confidence. And I guess to your original question, maybe why I coach men now, is because I feel like after a certain amount of time being a man, I've got some experience, and I feel strongly there is a role now for older men especially, or men in midlife, to step into a different way of being in the world, perhaps, whatever that wants to be for them. But I think coaching can really help as a practice and a process, bring that out and create these, whether they're rites of passage or containers, to be able to explore some of the bigger questions that naturally come up in midlife. Midlife has been really badly sold to us. It's either sold as a crisis, or it's a bit of a joke, or we're laughed at as men. It's difficult. Our bodies changing, our kids are leaving home if we're lucky to have children. Maybe our careers are coming to an end. We're a little bit lost in what comes next. And there's no one asking us, are you okay? What do you want to do? Or what do you feel you can bring next? You're still perceived in your own head, amongst others as well, is that sort of 35-year-old version of yourself. As you can see, I've adopted the long grey beard, not because, it's some sort of persona, but maybe it is, I don't know. But it's like there are fundamental questions about how you feel about being a man in the world when you're older. There's more behind you than there is in front of you in many ways. And maybe I think there are relative spaces for that conversation to happen. And if you marry that or parallel that with businesses, as you mentioned, I mean, I can't tell you the amount of times I've seen a business designed in the same psychology as the CEO and the founder. It's extraordinary. You're absolutely right. And it's a very interesting question that probably haven't got time for now, but that's kind of where I sit, is the decoupling of maybe a founder who's run a business for 30 years is coming to the end of his career. His whole identity is wrapped up in that business. It's a very difficult shift to make when that no longer serves him anymore, or there's a reason for an exit or whatever it may be. And not only for founders, but also career professionals, whoever it may be, there's a shift that has to happen. And identity work is a lot of the work that I do with men, is rather than trying to hold on to the past, what is the next story, the next chapter, the next threshold, and work with it as a positive opportunity, because we're all living a little bit longer, hopefully. And the world moves rapidly. And I think if I can just slow down some time for these men, just to really sit in some of those questions, that's the service I'm bringing. And I appreciate that this is not inclusive to everybody. And to your point about working with people online as well, yes, that can happen. But I admit where I've focused my work is, to be honest, I'm sensitive to it, but I'm honest about it, is with those who hold power. And they tend to be white, privileged, educated men. My career has paralleled my journey. I'm not apologizing for it necessarily, but I'm conscious of it and I'm aware of it. But I can only do that work because I know it. I have permission to walk into those doors because I look the way I look. So for me to work maybe in other areas because I want to would be slightly disingenuous. And I've realized that actually that's where we need to do a lot of the work, is in those types of boardrooms or with those types of men. And they want it because they are trapped by the system that they're in. And they are looking for something deeper and more real and more purposeful as they approach these sort of timeframes in their life.
The thing that was coming up for me there a moment ago, Al, was I'm surprised, having had this conversation with you so far, that there aren't queues of men wanting to do this, because they must be able to, at least in some of the conversation we've had today, be able to recognise themselves in some shape or form. You speak to identity there. I know that's a big thing. You speak about the threshold of midlife. That's a big thing. And you could almost guess that that actually affects every man universally. And so there's a disconnect here between the number of men in the world that perhaps need this and the number of men showing up for this type of work that you're describing. What do you think is behind that disconnect? And what do you feel could be done to make it a bit easier for men to make this transition? Conscious of the fact that earlier in our conversation today, you mentioned you only have to scratch a couple of millimeters beneath the surface for it to start coming out, whatever that may be for that individual. So I'm curious.
And I'm curious too. This work goes deep and I'm tentative around it as well in many ways. I need to be, as a coach, resourced and in the right place to hold these types of spaces for others. So that's not something I just turn on in a kind of modernist way where it's, I'm running programs every month. This does tend to flow in more seasonal rhythms than a mechanistic business model. And that very much aligns with, obviously, how I design my thinking and my processes as well. So as I said before, I think initially maybe I need to get a better marketing department, number one. But joking aside, I think, and I was thinking about this the other day, I think I'm going to try and work with 100 men or some number where I can work with 4 men at a time, where we create a small intentional community over 3 days or whatever it may be. These things obviously change sometimes, and do that 3 times a year. So I'm fully resourced, and those men that show up are ready and willing and able and committed to the work. I'm not looking to scale a big coaching practice, but I'm looking to work with people at depth. Rob, I think there are plenty of men out there who probably feel this. You can probably tell a lot of the ways I approach this is potentially maybe academic or quite rigorous or deep in its thinking, but there needs to be a translation now into what that really looks like for someone who might get in touch with me. And I've gone through many, many iterations of that. And I think a long walk over 3 days with a small group of men to explore some of the bigger questions in life is really where I'm at. But just to say, underpinning all of that is a lot of rigor and thought about rites of passage, the separation, the idea of liminality, threshold work, reincorporation, all of those things, and nature connection and that ecological self. And the training that I've had over the many years brings all of that, dare I say it, mastery to this type of offer, because it takes time and it's not something that can be kind of scaled and brought to everybody. I truly believe that men, when they're ready, will find these opportunities, and I hope I have the privilege of working with them.
That's great. That's really insightful too. And to your point there, it's a case of, it's almost a bit like when the student's ready, the teacher will appear type scenario. With that in mind, Al, I'm curious, in terms of where you're at in your own journey right now, what's been useful for you? What's recently inspired you perhaps, or where do you feel you personally, and I appreciate this is a more personal question rather than about your practices, about your own journey now, where you feel you've made some shifts, or maybe not even recently, but at this midlife threshold that we were touching upon earlier, what has been helpful to you and what are the shifts that you've been experiencing so far?
Thanks, Rob, for the question. I have kind of made peace with myself in many ways around where I'm at. I've been chasing a lot of the validation in my life through qualification and degrees and certificates and knowledge and learning. My father left when I was very young, so I am drawn to this work for many reasons, but that is a fundamental driver. I've always searched for guidance in the world and have looked for validation in the world, like we all do. I've done that in my 20s and 30s through knowledge and almost a voracious appetite for gaining more knowledge to try and work something out. But I've come through my own deep practice as well and lots of processes to come to peace with the fact that I don't need to learn anymore necessarily. I need to kind of unlearn quite a lot, probably. And that phrase is sort of banded around a little bit, but I think it's something about what I'm offering out into the world now, which is a space to kind of stop and slow down and not chase something that is external to you. A lot of that happiness and satisfaction, or maybe some of the space or gaps you're looking for in your life, can be found internally. So it's a life's work. And I think, as I've referenced in many different ways, perhaps, there's only something that can show up at a certain time of life where you can do a certain type of thing, I think. This experience and my journey can only be held by me. And I've just kind of worked that out, really. I think it's, to be honest, that was me prototyping walking as a process and asking questions out in nature was very much me designing what I'm offering to the world here is to other men is it takes time and space to create conditions to ask these type of deeper questions. So, yeah, I'm in a place where I'm circling back around a little bit. I've got 3 children who are now adults who are finding their way out in the world. So I have a lot more capacity. And again, going back to capacity, to hold spaces for others and be much more of a service in the world than trying to extract what I need now, because my nest is comfortably feathered and my job now is to give back and be of service and let go and support others.
There's something in that which you just shared with me, which reminds me of maybe for a lot of coaches, the reason they got into coaching is to not only explore the space and answer some questions for themselves about themselves, but it's also to be in a space where they want to be with others and to connect with others as well. And perhaps to put it another way is to explore their challenges and their curiosities, but not alone, but also bringing to the connection some facilitation, which is some guidance and some structure and some facilitation, which could sometimes be the missing thing for that to happen. So there was this image coming up there for me, just as you were describing that. And I'm thinking about your walks and your circles now. And there's something about the community or the communion there of those individuals together, that holding a question together. There's a sort of a mastermind which is created by being together and seeing where that goes.
Yeah, men are trained to do things on their own. We are trained to solve things on our own. And I'm the worst culprit for this. And I know this in myself now. In speaking to your point earlier, the revelations I've had are I can't do it on my own, even though that's my default setting, like most men.
Yeah.
I don't need advice. I don't need anyone's help. I can sort this out on my own. And unfortunately, that is a bit of a redundant model. I think we can all appreciate that. Again, that also speaks to your earlier question about there should be cues around the block, maybe for this type of coaching work. There's a resistance to step into community because we are not practiced at it anymore. And it's hard and it's messy and it's emotional. And we aren't, our feminine is completely dialed down and we operate in a version of masculinity that is overgeared and wants to be dominant and successful and extractive and provide solutions and answers and be all-knowing. And I think if you look at obviously McKilchrist's work and others and many, many others about the balance that we need to kind of explore now around creativity, our femininity, our feminine, our community, our care in the world. These are things that men aren't exposed to necessarily, but I know they're there. I know they're there. In all the circles I've been in and the conversations I've had with other men, they're there. You've experienced it too. It comes back to these permission and seeing others maybe do it will help. But I think things are changing, in a positive way. But maybe my generation is still lagging behind in many ways around that. So, I picked a real challenge. I'm under no illusion. Successful men of my appearance and background in education and coming from a Western industrial logic is a real hard nut to crack. We are not easy. It's not an easy niche market, I tell you. But I'm here for the challenge.
Yeah.
Because I feel it.
I'm curious, in the work that you do, I asked you about your own shifts and changes, but you must also see some positive shifts and changes in others. Because I can imagine our listener listening with curiosity to our conversation and being curious about what do you notice? I'm not expecting an answer where somebody's, quotes, fixed. We're all a work in progress. But I can imagine on those 3-day walks, for example, or those experiences, you must see somebody leaving that. You couldn't leave an experience like that, I imagine, as an unchanged man. So you must see men arriving there and the men you see leaving there. Could you sum up some of the shifts and changes that you see through an experience like that?
Yeah, I see it on many levels. I see it immediately in the way that they just show up. So we're walking in the woods with a client and they're like 10 feet ahead of me. I'm like, whoa, slow down. You're running at a different cadence because that's the system you come from. And that's a very obvious representation of just where they're at, their physiology and their rhythm and their process. And that's fine. We all do that. We end up, get off the tube and suddenly we're running at a pace because that's the system that we're streaming into.
Yeah.
I see it on that level and I see it on other levels about grasping for solutions, quick fixes, patches, answers, almost testing me for what gives you the right to hold this type of thing. What answers do you provide? And an immediate power play happens. And as I said, because I'm 6'5" and I'm big in the world, I can hold those types of challenges without too much confrontation. And I've had plenty of it in terms of that power dynamic, and that positions in the gang or the tribe is an immediate process that we all do, whether we turn up at a barbecue at a friend's house or we meet someone who's new in the pub. There's an immediate sensing of where I'm at in this hierarchy and this order. And that's a lot of that is to do with strength and power and dominance. Now, we won't admit that, but it's true. It happens in a nano moment and we're all sussing each other out. So I know that as a man that happens, and I can just work with it and let it ride, but I can kind of predict how all of this energy will fizz at the beginning, and then it'll start to just, as nature takes its course, we get back into our body, the blisters might happen, or it's sheeting it down with rain, or the weather's terrible. We start to think in different ways, and we get much more into sort of a collaborative mindset, and we start to share, and we come into community. And I think, without sounding esoteric about it, it happens. I see it happen. The 3-day window is called the wilderness effect. It's psychologically studied. It happens. As I said before, it's designed in that way with rigor and intention to allow that settling and that process to kind of play out and then settle down again. But I think on another level, it's very simple. Men feel heard and seen, and they feel listened to, and they feel able to have the time and the space to step out of what might be described as the man box, the provider, the solid representative, to be able to soften a bit and not have an answer for a couple of days and just sink into some deeper patterns of thought and rhythms and processes. Our theme previously around allowance and permission and conditions, that allows for all of that. I don't need to do very much at all. There's some stat that suggests that almost 65% of men feel that no one cares whether they're okay or not. No one ever asked them. When was the last time someone said to you, genuinely, just out of the blue, Rob, how you doing? Without it being trivial, and then moving on to something else. They're simple things.
They are. And outside of my wife and family, I can't remember, actually, from a male friend of mine, for example. Probably pick up where we left off in the sort of increasing few and far between interactions we have now with raising families and all the rest of it. But you make a really great point there. Conscious of time, and we're going to have to pause our conversation there, I'm afraid. But this has been a fascinating insight to your world, Al, for me. And I'm sure we've only just scratched the surface. So I would love to ask you 2 closing questions, if I may. The first is there anything that you feel you would like to share with a listener in the context of what we've talked about today? Is there anything left unsaid that you feel needs to be shared with our listener today?
Thanks, Rob. I don't have a prescriptive list or anything like that, but I think permission, whether it comes from a coaching offer like mine or wherever else, any other superb coaches out in the world, permission to yourself as a man, just to allow yourself some time and space that isn't full of activity or stimulation or whatever it may be, and just see how that feels, is just an invitation from me to just go and explore that and maybe take a question out into the world and see what comes back. Don't look too hard for an answer and just see what else is out there. But in terms of the conversation we've had today, all I'd say is, as I'm sure everyone who's listened this far can probably tell, this is always a work in progress. I think coaching should be an alive process. I think it should be something that for those who might want to get into coaching or exploring it, and this runs across any kind of offer, I guess. If it's too fixed, I'd be wary of it. I think we need to, especially in the current context of how we're all living through the world at the moment, our practices have to reflect what's going on in the wider context. It is relational, and we have to provide potentially more interesting or deeper spaces to explore some of these fundamental questions, because otherwise we are propping up a system that isn't serving the world in the way that we need it to be right now. And especially as men, I think there's such a beautiful potential that is possible if we just allow ourselves to go there. I don't have the answer, but I'm going to try and find out, hopefully in the company of others. That's what I'd say.
Yeah, that's a lovely place to leave our conversation, Al. And for any of our listeners that are keen to connect with you, hearing you on this podcast, where can they find you, Al?
You can have a look at some of my work on humannature.coach. That's my website. And you'll also see a link on there to Modern Pilgrim, which is a kind of evolving offer around some of the things we've talked about today around these 3-day long walks for men. And please reach out on LinkedIn as well. Happy to have a conversation. It's been a real pleasure, Rob. Thank you for the opportunity to explore and maybe even clarify some of my thinking for myself. So thank you.
You're very welcome. And thank you for your time today, Al. It's been really insightful and I felt a very honest conversation. So very grateful for that. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. For over 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organisations, and society. To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or visit our webpage at associationforcoaching.com. Explore our digital learning hub and enjoy our extensive library of on-demand webinars, interviews, podcasts, and a portfolio of live events for your continuing professional development.